back, guys. We're entering 1 Samuel this week. Now we're jumping into 1 Samuel. We're finally getting into like some more interesting narratives. So yeah, a lot of good information. We're just gonna, go probably through the first half of it.
Yeah.
We don't know who wrote it. I think like in my research, some parts of it can be attributed to Samuel, and that's based on a part in, I think it's 1 Chronicles 29. Writings basically of Samuel, Nathan, and there's some other dudes.
Yeah.
And so maybe.
Yeah, and it makes sense that the judges that were presiding basically over those, the prophets, would be the ones that would be writing it down and stuff. So
yeah.
Samuel is kind of interesting because it's a somewhat of a transitionary period. So Samuel was perhaps the last true judge. Not only was he a prophet, but he was kind of the leader and the judge over this before they kind of shift over into the monarchy.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we're seeing this as far as big picture and coming from judges and the time where everybody did what was right in their own eyes, because at that time Israel had no king, and we're about to have a king. And so for better or for worse, that's what's going to happen. And when we get to chapter 8, we'll see, how God feels about it all. And that's kind of where we're going this Sunday as well. But so it starts off with Samuel, and we are all, a lot of these stories, essentially, when we preach Old Testament, it seems like this is where we come to all these different stories of David and Samuel and Saul and so on and so forth. So,
I mean, yeah, it's easy to read through the narratives, and, you can find nuggets in there. It's all the, you don't want to preach through Leviticus normally.
yeah, all them laws.
For Randall, he didn't want to preach through Deuteronomy.
Yeah. So first off, I mean, as far as we get a little bit of Samuel's background as far as who his parents are. Yep. And, this guy has 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. And Hannah means gracious, whereas Peninnah means coral or curler. I thought that was kind of interesting. It's like, wait, so what does this girl's name mean? Yeah, but Hannah means graciousness, so that feels right.
I'm starting to think, the more that I look into the names, that they're not actually naming these people what they were named. They're like, this was how they were described.
Yeah, maybe.
And, who knows if these were how they were actually addressed. But anyway, if they are, then that's...
Yeah, that's telling.
Yeah.
Well, and then you get into, we'll get there. But so Hannah and Peninnah, they're the 2 wives. Peninnah could have kids and Hannah could not. Right. And so that was the major deal. And that was a common theme back, all throughout the Old Testament. We're seeing that was a big deal. And people saw that as either God's blessing or God's cursing. And so Hannah, we're going to see, she's constantly going to God because she knows that God's got to be the one to make this happen.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, whether it is truly the affliction, we see it big picture. We get to see it that way, and we see what God is doing in Hannah's life, and we see her prayer afterwards and how that comes in to play. But so first of all, we've got essentially this God-fearing man compared to Eli, the priest, and his 2 sons. And so we're going to see a lot of contrast in this book. Oh, yeah. And one of the first ones is that one I see between Hannah and her husband, and then Elkanah, is it? Or
Elkanah.
Yeah. I basically see he's God-fearing. Eli is kind of in between. He is God-fearing. He knows his job, but at the same time, it's not to the point, as we will see later, where he's actually going to do something about what his sons are doing. Right. And so we mentioned, it mentions the 2 sons of Eli were Hophni and Phinehas, and they were priests of the Lord, but they were worthless men, as they're kind of described. They have perhaps Egyptian names, and if you want to go into the meaning, one means tadpole, Hophni, at least what I looked up, that's what I'm finding. And then the other one just means dark-skinned one. Maybe as an Egyptian, he was darker than the rest of them. But anyway, so there you go. So Hannah and Peninnah is basically making fun of Hannah. That's where we're at. She's making fun of her, kind of constantly giving her, it says that she was her rival and constantly like lording it over. Yeah. Much in the same way that when we had way back at Sarah and Hagar, but a very similar type of story. And so,
yeah, I mean, honestly, a lot of the forefathers, it was Sarah and Hagar, Leah and Rachel. Mm-hmm. And so this is just another one of those rival wife situations, which, to me, I'm thinking why would you even put yourself in a situation and grab 2 wives? But anyway,
continues on.
Yeah. For me, when I was reading through this, I was noticing, it kind of seems the way that Elkanah is putting it, why are you pitying yourself? Mm-hmm. And, that is probably not the way that this should be read into it. And maybe this is just the way that the writers are kind of putting him in this light as, he doesn't really understand what his wife's going through. But I see it as Hannah knows, and it'll become more apparent as we read through her song in chapter 2. Hannah knows that there's an anointed one that is going to be coming through the seed of woman. The way that I see this is she mourns her barrenness, not because of her own barrenness, but because she has faith that God is going to do something through the seed of woman. And she sees herself more in the line, if I can't do this, then God can't work through me. And so her self-worth is put on the line here. I see it as an act of faith, one, that she does go every year to, pray to the Lord. And this one time in particular, she actually gets an answer.
Yeah. It's interesting that you see, you don't want to bet up against the ones that are barren, I guess is what I'm seeing. Like the ones that you mentioned, the ones that eventually end up having kids are the ones that are typically used mightily.
Right.
You don't bet against the ones and you don't tease them, for sure. And so Peninnah, she gets very little in this story, but Hannah is obviously the one that we are looking at and modeling ourselves after, if you will. As it comes, we are familiar with the story. Hannah's praying. It's a yearly custom. That's part of this, the way that we see Elkanah is he's a God-fearing man. He wants to go. He's abiding by the law and stuff. He's faithful, if you will. And so as they're up for their yearly time, then Hannah goes and she prays again, and Eli notices her, and he just assumes that she's drunk. And sometimes we think, okay, well, based on his sons, maybe that's why he's just used to this.
Yeah.
He's like, well, I've seen this before.
Yeah, like how much longer are you going to be in here, drunk woman?
Yeah. And so essentially, I get the feeling that he feels bad. Like, oh man, I really stuck my foot in my mouth on this one.
Yeah. So then the Lord does grant her as she has asked, and Hannah becomes pregnant.
Yeah.
And it says that she named him Samuel, thinking, I asked the Lord for him. And I looked into the name because I was curious, does Samuel really mean asked of the Lord? And it kind of does, and it kind of doesn't. I think the most literal transliteration of it would be name of God. El is God, and then Shama is name, or Sham is name. But then there's Shama El, and that means heard of God.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a better translation of the name than name of God. So anyway, if you look up the meaning of the name Samuel, you'll probably the first thing you'll see is name of God. But in this context, it probably is meaning God heard me. And so therefore, I'm going to name him Samuel, which means heard of God.
Well, and one of the things that we would look at this, and we're kind of like, if we put ourselves in her shoes, it almost seems odd that she would be like, well, I'm going to have him for this very brief time, and then I'm just going to give him to the Lord. And then, I'm not only going to see him like once a year is what we get, as far as what it looks like. And so it's like, man, all that just for, to give him up. Like most of the time when we're thinking we're begging the Lord for something, we're thinking we're going to keep it.
Yeah, right.
And Hannah, that is not the case.
Oh, another thing that stuck out to me here too is if you have the NET version, it says at the bottom, the name Samuel, meaning name of God, sounds like the Hebrew verb translated for asked. But Saul, the name Saul, is a transliteration of the Hebrew word Shaul, and it means asked. So for it to be like the same, it doesn't really fit. And that's just my beef with the NET translators right there.
Well, and I mean, sometimes we are given the name meaning. And so she's, I mean, in verse 20, then it does say that I have asked for him from the Lord. And so she was intending for this name to clarify and even to tell people, as a testimony that God gave me this son.
Right.
It is interesting just to note the way she says that I've lent him to the Lord. As long as he is lent to the Lord. And it's like, wait a minute. No, I think you got that backwards. Yeah. God lent him to you, and then now he's back. But she is true to her word. So she makes this deal with God basically. And she's like, hey, God, if you give me this, if you bless me in this way, then I'm going to give him back to you. And so she does. After he is weaned, then she gives him to the service of the tabernacle. And there he stays, and he grows up in the tabernacle, basically. And so chapter 2, we have this prayer. What are some of the things that you're noticing there?
Right off the bat, the first verse. Indeed, I rejoiced in your I rejoice in your deliverance, and that immediately brought to mind. I think it's 2 Timothy 3 or 2:3 through that really controversial part.
As far as being saved through childbearing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's 1 Timothy 2. She will be delivered through childbearing if she continues in faith and love. And I don't know why that brought to my mind, but I feel like she understands that an anointed one is coming and that it'll be through woman, the seed of woman. Then she feels like she can play a part in this if the Lord allows her to have a child. So she doesn't understand the impact of, what Samuel's going to do, in these moments, but she feels that there is deliverance in her being able to give birth to Samuel. So, she praises the Lord for his deliverance through this miraculous birth.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we have to constantly keep in mind is when God had promised Abraham and he called him out, then he promised him a land. And actually, Randall just mentioned it. He said not that long ago, but it's land, leader, and that they would become a nation. For sure, they're looking for their leader. Like that's one of the main things that they're looking for because they have now become a nation as far as a multitude of people.
Right.
And they also have their land. They're in the process of continuing to conquer the land and drive out the people that were there. But they're really looking for that leader. As we find out in other passages, they're really looking for that prophet and priest and king.
Yep.
And as we go to Saul and his problem, then that'll come into play as well.
Right.
It's great in the fact that I rejoice in your salvation. There's none who is holy like the Lord, none beside you. And just reiterating that fact that God is holy, no rock like our God. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting is she goes in and shows just how God often is flipping the script. He makes the poor rich. He can bring the rich down low. Those who have no power, he can raise into power. He can take those that are in power and take them out of power.
Yep.
And so it's interesting that when he brings life and he ends life, he's the author of life and death. All this type of stuff, that everything, first of all, you're noticing that she is declaring the sovereignty of God, but also that there is great contrast, and it kind of lays the foundation for the contrast that we are going to see. Because God is going to take David, and he's constantly saying, who am I? And yet I'm in the presence of the king. Saul kind of says the same thing, at least at first. He's like, who am I?
I'm just a Benjamin.
Yeah. And he's like hiding. He's head and shoulders above the rest, but he's hiding behind,
Yeah.
It's kind of a funny picture there. But we've also seen that already in Joseph. We've seen it, time and time again, where God is taking the lowly and bringing them up and exalting them, the ones who are faithful, and then bringing down the ones who are proud. And we're going to constantly see that same pattern here.
Yeah. So based on this song, I feel like Hannah has experienced this. And so, she was nothing, and now she is something because of what the Lord has done.
Yeah.
And it's a good testimony.
On the back side of it, I do wonder if it's a little bit like, driving something into Penina, because just the way that she's like, my mouth derides my enemies. She's like, ha, take that, Penina. So we have that. And then the first contrast is seen between all of this and Samuel, so we get this picture of Samuel, and then it kind of has this little interlude where he says, now the sons of Eli were worthless men.
Yeah.
So we've got this good stuff, and everything is happening, and the boy is ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli and the priest. Then it mentions his sons. So you've got the son of Hannah and Elkanah, and then you've got Eli's sons. They're worthless men. And so there's huge contrast there. They're greedy. Yeah. They're all into the sensuality, gluttony. They're godless as opposed to God-fearing. And they become gatekeepers is kind of how I put it, to use the modern day terms that we like to use.
Some things that I found interesting were they used a 3-prong fork to grab more meat than like the typical 2-prong fork. And they would take it out of the boiling water before it had become tender so that they could get more because it wasn't falling apart. And that's like, the epitome of greed. They abused the women that were stationed at the entrance of the tent. And different translations render this differently. It could be, women that were serving at the entrance of the tent. I think the Hebrew word there is the same Hebrew word that is used in Exodus 38 when the women were bringing their bronze mirrors to basically be melted down to make the basin. Who knows why these women were really there at this point? They could have been dedicated, just like Samuel was at birth. Yeah, so they would just, abuse them. It also, my mind when I read it first was like, were these women here because this is some kind of like pagan thing that they...
Yeah, like they're doing the same thing as the pagan gods.
stole that from the people that were around them and, decided they were going to make a living there. Could be, but I don't really know. But it's just as crazy how basically the priests were not being priestly, because in verse, what is it? No, it's 15, where basically the people are telling the priests what they need to do.
Yeah.
Also, they burn the fat. The priest's attendants would come and say to the person who was making the sacrifice, give some meat for the priest to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. They should certainly burn the fat away first, and then take for yourself what you wish. And then they were basically like, no, we're not going to do it that way.
Yeah, because they wanted what was the best for themselves. They like the roasted meat as opposed to the boiled meat. And if you've ever had, especially like if it's goat or something like that, I've had boiled goat and it's not as good as roasted. But they're also violent. We're seeing that because they're like, hey, if you're not going to listen to us, then we're going to take it by force. And so we're seeing that not only in what they want to eat, but also, like you were saying, that they abusing the women that were there too. And so this sin was very great in the sight of the Lord. And we're like, yeah, it is.
Yeah. And he decided that he was going to kill them for it.
Yeah.
But, a couple times here, verse 18 and 26, we see that Samuel is finding favor with the Lord and with people.
Yeah.
So, contrast with the sons of Eli.
Yeah, constant contrast. And so Eli, he's hearing this, and it's not like it's a surprise, I guess. You can't imagine that he does not know already. And not only that, but when I come down and I look at verse 22, he's very old. He kept hearing, so he's constantly hearing this as far as what his sons were doing to all Israel, how they would lay with the women, serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and so on. And so it's been going on for a while, and really, my mind goes back to that Deuteronomy 21, where if they had somebody, if there was parents that had a rebellious child, and that's that whole, you've got to stone the rebellious child. Well, this was a kind of an ongoing thing. So it wasn't like, okay, my kid didn't listen to me, but it was like, if they do not heed what they're supposed to be doing. And so this is a prime case that they are constantly rebellious against their father. He basically calls them out, but at the same time, he's not doing anything further. Well, what he's probably supposed to do at that point is stone them. And so Eli is probably, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think one of the reasons why he's letting it go is because he knows what comes next, and he doesn't want to give up his sons. He doesn't want to have to kill them.
Yeah.
And if he had a message from God, if he had any clue as far as God had set them apart for destruction, then that's got to be tough. So
he does get this message from a man of God, towards the end of chapter 2, and it says that, he's basically his days of being a priest are over with his family.
Yeah. And so since Eli won't put them to death, then the Lord will.
Right.
Main thing to mention, I guess, within chapter 2, before we go into chapter 3, is the fact that, again, we see that God is going to raise up a faithful servant. And my question, too, who's going to do what is according to my heart and in my mind, whether he's actually referring to just Samuel, because we can see that Samuel is the one that he's immediately raising up, and perhaps the kings too. But if he's actually speaking to the covenant that he's made, there's going to be this anointed one, the anointed, right? And so whether this is kind of a messianic type of thing. So
I did think about that when I read it the first time. It did just seem very messianic, but I didn't want to just read into it too much, so I didn't.
Yeah, the only question that I would have, I guess, within that is, who shall go in and out before my anointed forever? And so it's kind of like that, perhaps the line, maybe, as opposed to, because the anointed would be, I would think, would be Christ.
Right.
Chapter 3.
Yeah, this is where Samuel is, hearing voices from the Lord. And I, took note that it said that it's very rare that revelatory visions, would happen. So Samuel wasn't expecting it, and Eli wasn't expecting it. So, Samuel hears these voices, and Samuel answers, hey, Eli, why are you calling me? Eli's like, no, I didn't call you. And, eventually that happened a few times until Eli realized, I think this is the Lord calling you. So, just next time, say, here I am, Lord. And then that was the way that Samuel was called, an auditory voice from the Lord saying, Samuel, you are going to be my prophet, basically.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that, in that fourth time, basically, then the Lord came and stood calling Samuel as other times.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever really noticed we think, okay, he's just hearing voices. Maybe it's a dream, maybe it's a vision, and that could very well be the case. But, when I'm reading it this time, I'm like, okay, so is it like there's, for all intents and purposes, Samuel's seeing a man, that's standing before him. It's just interesting wording at the very least.
Yeah, so the way that I get it is it kind of seems like Samuel is replacing Eli and his family, but I'm not sure if that really worked out in the case, unless Eli was the judge too, and maybe he was. I feel like Samuel's taking more on the judge role than just a priest role.
Yeah.
And you definitely see that he is a prophet in the way that he speaks with Saul and David, later on.
Yeah, it's interesting that even though all of this, Samuel still has a hard time, one, because he's young, but also, because these are hard words that he's got to share with Eli. And Eli, this is, again, not new news for him as far as what God has already told him what is going to happen through the man of God, but now it's coming through Samuel. And so basically Eli says, may God do to you and more also if you hide anything from me. So basically he's kind of like extorting him in a sense. Yeah. So he's like, let me make sure I tell you everything. And so from then on, basically Samuel was known to be a prophet of the Lord.
Right.
And so, that's probably where the judging kind of comes into play too, because people would come and they would want to hear from God. And so if he's a prophet for sure, then that brings judgment as well, as far as what has God said on this, and we see that constantly, as time goes on, as far as between David and Saul. So in the meantime, in chapter 4, we're seeing that this is the whole Ark of the Presence going into into the hands of the Philistines, because basically they lost, right?
Yeah, and this is weird because they're treating the Ark like some kind of, I don't know, good luck charm.
Yeah.
When in reality, what the Ark represents is the presence of God with the people of Israel, and so the fact that they are bringing it into battle as like, look what we have. God's going to reward us for doing this. They're treating it more like an idol than they're treating it like the presence of God.
Yeah.
And my opinion, and I don't know how they even got this out here, but they shouldn't have brought the Ark out anyway.
Yeah.
It should have stayed, in the tabernacle where it belongs. And so then the consequences of those actions are they lost it. And I think this just goes along with the same storylines that we've been reading through Judges and even in the beginning of this book, but everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and they had no king. And it's not that they didn't have a king, they didn't recognize who their king was, and it was the Lord.
Yeah.
And so they just started doing whatever they think they can. And I think the influence comes mainly from the pagan worship of those that are in the lands around them. They're just influenced by all this supernatural or superstitious stuff, really.
Yeah. And that's kind of where my mind would go. I totally get the good luck charm aspect of it, but at the same time, when the way the Philistines respond in other times where they're like, oh man, the gods have come among them, and so now they're trembling, and we're going to fight still, we're going to try, but they're afraid because they're thinking, okay, the Israelites' gods have come among their camp or whatever. And so they are seeing that as the presence of God. So instead of, going to God and saying, God, are you giving these people into our hands? What should we do? Who's going to lead? Do we go up now? Do we wait? All that type of stuff. Then they're seeing it as, okay, well, if we take this and this is God's presence, then surely God will help us out. And so the good luck charm in that aspect, but they're seeing it as, this is how we make things work. If we do this and we have the presence of God, then surely we will win.
Yeah. There's only a couple of times where God had commanded, take the ark. And one of those times that we read about is Jericho, and there was not even, for them to get into Jericho, it was just to walk around it with the ark and, blow their trumpets and their ram's horns.
Yeah.
And so that is unconventional warfare.
Yeah, very much so.
And so this is, we're going to go in here, we're just going to bring the ark and see what happens, hoping that the ark will work for us.
Yeah. It worked before. Hopefully it'll work again.
Yeah. It did not.
Yeah. So not only during all that time when the Israelites were defeated in that way and the ark was taken, then the prophecy comes true. Hophni and Phinehas die, the sons of Eli. And so somebody escapes, a man from Benjamin runs from the battle line. He came back to Shiloh. He's talking to Eli. And when Eli hears that not only was the ark taken, but also his sons had died in the battle, that's when he falls over and dies. And it says, for the man was old and heavy. And my mind goes back to, dude had to be fat.
Yeah.
Because
if he's
he was
eating
probably, it was probably, my mind thinks, so was it just his sons, or was he like, hey, if they're taking it, then I might as well eat some? Or maybe they offered it to him or something like that. And so he's kind of getting fat off all this stuff.
Especially if he's eating, if they're not reserving the fat for the Lord and they're eating the fat, they're going to get fat.
Well, and not only that, but so God had obviously given them certain things that they were allowed to take. And, and it seems like it was generous. Like when I go back and I was reading it and stuff, I was like, well, it seems like it's pretty generous. It seems like it's going to take care of these priests and stuff. And again, I don't think that it would be enough to where they'd be rich, but at the same time, they'd be taken care of. And yet he's obviously gone beyond that somehow, some way, perhaps. And maybe not, but it says that he was old and heavy. So he fell over, cracked his head open, basically broke his neck. And so that's how he died. Yeah. And it doesn't stop there. And so the daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant. She gives birth. And so we find out that she dies in childbearing. And before she dies, she names her son Ichabod. And we get the meaning of it too, as far as the glory has departed from Israel, or the glory of God.
I think it's interesting that she's, now realizing that the glory has departed from Israel based on the Ark of the Covenant being stolen or captured by the Philistines. But I think that we see the glory of God has departed from Israel long before we get to this point. There's not much more to that for me, but I was just was thinking like, oh, this is interesting that they're realizing it now.
Well, and I think it's good for us to realize too that, and as much as we're quick to judge the Israelites and the time of the judges or the time before that, we really see just how much we are wrestling through all these things as well.
Absolutely.
And so, when we look at them, we're like, oh man, you've got some people that are following faithfully, and you've got some people that are you're like, wait a minute. How are you even claiming to be an Israelite or a person of God? How do you claim God as your God? Because you're not living it out. And so I think it's good for us to see this because we're seeing all of that today as well. Like we would look around in church and we would see people that claim the name of Christ and we'd be like, we know we're not supposed to judge, but at the same time, we're like, if you really do claim the name of Christ, shouldn't things change? Shouldn't you be more faithful, so to speak? Yeah. And of course, when we're looking in the mirror, we would say the same thing. It's like, God, why can't I get past this? Why do I still behave this way? Why do I still think this way? Why do I still have these attitudes? So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of relevance, I guess, to all of this.
Yeah.
So the ark, when it goes into the Philistines' hands, this is kind of funny to me as far as what happens, because here you've got the ark of God, which people are saying, okay, well, this is a good luck charm. And they're like, okay, we captured, them. And so obviously our God is better than their God and, the Philistines. Yeah. So they bring it into the temple of their God. And these are two inanimate objects, but yet one is shown to have power and one is shown to definitely not have power, because not only does one, the way they see it, one knock down the other while nobody's looking, but they have to set up Dagon again. They have to set him back up. And then next time falls down, then now the head's gone.
Yeah, and
head is cut off and the arms
yeah.
are off. And so now they're like, oh, great. What does this mean? And so essentially what's also funny is they're like, hey, let's see what happens. This is kind of getting ahead of the story, but when they say, let's see what happens, whether all these things that have happened to us, is it just coincidence or is it really the God of Israel that's against us, as far as when they send the cows out and, attach to the cart. So they spread it out across all of the Philistine territory, basically.
Right. Yeah. And they should have learned long before.
You would think.
They're like, oh man, we got swords. Let's send it over here.
Yeah.
Oh man, they got swords too. And then, at the end of it, the amount of people that have died is crazy. And then whoever didn't die has swords. So they've basically terror all around the Philistine territory because they have captured the ark of the Lord.
Yeah, and we would look at this and we'd be like, why can't they learn beforehand? But at the same time, they're doing exactly probably what we would do. Be like, well, maybe it was just coincidence. Let's try it again. Okay, we'll take it. Yeah. But it keeps going, and so finally they're like, we ain't taking this. Send it back. when they gather the 5 heads of the Philistines together, the 5 lords, basically. In chapter 6 is where we're at if you guys are tracking along or trying to figure out where we are. But they basically, they're going in and they're saying, hey, what should we do? We know we should send it back, but should we send it back empty or whatever? And so they basically say, hey, we need to add a guilt offering with it. And so they have the way this translation puts it is 5 tumors and then 5 golden mice. And so that's what they're sending along with it. They put it on a cart. They attach it to 2 cows that have never been yoked together, basically never pulled a cart. And then they say, well, we'll see which way it goes. If it goes back, we know it was God. If it goes away or turns away, then we know it was just by coincidence.
Turns out it was by God.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler.
Yeah, and so it didn't veer off. It went straight.
Beth Shemesh is where it ended up. They basically took care of it there. And they kind of, the way that this version reads, they make it seem like it just kind of stayed on the hill.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's true, but it was obviously in an open place because people would look into it. I don't know what the ESV says, but the NET says looked into the ark. Yeah. And I think that is different than look upon the ark.
Yeah. Because, and we talked about this.
Yeah, we did. And I hadn't, looked at this yet when we were talking about it the other day. But yeah, that is, for 50,000 some people to look into the ark, I could see being much different than just looking at the ark. Inside the ark was supposed to be the tablets, Aaron's rod, and a jar of manna that never went bad because that was just a
supernatural thing.
Right. They were supposed to have faith that these things were in the ark. And so then by looking into it, they're violating they're touching it when they're not supposed to. But also they're saying, we don't really have trust in God by, what Moses said was in the ark is in the ark. And so we want to look at it.
Yeah. And I wonder if they were, to a certain extent, they were just afraid of it because not only if they had any message of what had happened to the Philistines, but also just if they heard any stories and they knew that this was a super holy thing, then hopefully they would treat it with respect. And so maybe they were afraid that they were, they didn't want to touch it basically.
Right.
But eventually it does go up. They call down some people to take it back up and go to Kiriath Jearim, or however you might pronounce that. And so 20 years it was lodged there basically.
Yep, in the house of Abinadab.
Yeah.
Out of this whole section here, one of the things that I took away was God's holiness is not on anybody's side. Like the Philistines disrespected the ark and God punished them. The Israelites also disrespected the ark and did not treat it holy. God punished them as well. And so God's holiness is separate from these 2 distinct people groups. Though the Israelites are chosen and the Philistines are not, God's holiness is still the standard, and neither side were meeting the standard in these cases.
I think what happens here in chapter 7, verse 3. So when Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are really returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you. Direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. And so obviously they want to be delivered out of the hand of the Philistines, and that's a big motivation. And that's part of the reason why God has brought this upon the people and allowed the Philistines to win, essentially, that they would depend on him and know their dependence on him. But, Samuel's basically kind of calling him out. He's like, well, if you guys really want to show your devotion to God, if you really are going to serve God and serve God only, then yes, this is the covenant that we've made with him. So you need to return back to that.
Yeah.
And so their response is, yes, we've sinned against the Lord. But their fear is, and this is where I feel like it's telling, their response is, not only have we sinned against God, but you, Samuel, you're kind of our mediator. You're kind of our go-between. God likes you, it seems like, maybe. And so please don't cease to pray for us is kind of the idea. And I think that's kind of interesting that they're like, well, we're afraid of God. We're standoffish. So you need to be the one to go to God on our behalf because maybe he'll listen to you.
Yeah, that is interesting. Samuel does mediate for them and even offers a burnt offering to the Lord, and they end up defeating the Philistines there that day. Samuel erects an Ebenezer stone.
Yeah.
Basically saying, this is where the Lord has helped us.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I took note of is it says here that the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And so as long as Samuel was leading, the Philistines were not prevailing. Mm-hmm. That shows God's faithfulness to Samuel, but also just to the whole nation of Israel, because Samuel was leading by the will of God.
Yeah.
Rather than, just doing what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
And I think that's key here.
Yeah, for sure. So he gets old, Samuel does, and in chapter 8 we see that, and so he makes his sons judges over Israel, but his sons didn't walk in his ways. So they turned aside after gain, after greed. They took bribes. They perverted justice. And so this should remind us of what we've already read as far as who the leaders of people should be. And one of the main things is, hey, especially as priests, if you want to take priests, for example, they are not to take bribes. They're not to pervert justice. That's like rule number 1, guys. And yet they're described this way. And so all the people are like, hey, judges haven't worked, so give us a king.
Yeah. And, this is where it comes to the pinnacle of Israel's heart. Samuel kind of takes this personally, obviously.
Yeah.
Because, he's been leading these people, and God tells him, it's not you that they're rejecting. It's me that they're rejecting as king. And so that's the whole point of what God has set up, is that God would be king of Israel.
Yeah.
And they would be different than all the other nations. Instead, they want to be like all the other nations. And so Samuel calls this a sin, and I think that he's right.
Yeah.
Even though God set up, one day you're going to want a king, and back in Deuteronomy, here's how a king should act, and here's what he's going to be like. That was permitted by law, but their heart was not in the right motive. And so anyway, Samuel's like, you have sinned against God by wanting a king, because now you no longer are seeing that he's king. And I would say that they haven't seen that God is king for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. In some ways, it's kind of like a marriage that's broken. A lot of times where, we look at divorce and we mourn divorce and we say that this is not the will of God, certainly. But at the same time, when you look at the bigger picture, you're like, well, but there's been a lot of stuff that's been against the will of God that has led to it. It's just the sadness and the heartbreak within the brokenness, basically.
Yeah.
And so, Samuel, he's warning them, basically. He's like, hey, guys, I'm just going to reiterate, this is what's going to happen. Are you sure? Because, he's going to take everything from you guys, basically. He's going to do what he wants to do. And so, yes, instead, we're going to switch from everyone does what's right in their own eyes to this man will do whatever is right in his eyes. And so hopefully he'll follow God. But if not, then, hey, guys, he's the king. You made him king. And so he's going to do what he's going to do.
Right.
And you guys don't have any say about it. And he says at the very end in verse 18 of this particular passage, he says, in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And so their response is, after hearing all this, there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us. And here's where I feel like the kicker is, that they're going to fight our battles. They're like, they want to put it off on somebody else. We don't want to have to do it. We want somebody else to take care of us. We want somebody else that we can look to do everything.
Yeah, which is crazy, because that is literally what God told them he would do for them.
Yeah.
Like, I will go before you and I will fight your battles.
Yeah.
I think that's back in Joshua.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're not recognizing that. And so, they want a physical, flawed person to do this for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they get it.
Yeah.
Chapter 9.
Example number 1 in the long line. So Saul is chosen, and just to give you guys a little bit of some interesting, at least I thought it was interesting for the names. So Benjamin, there was a man of Benjamin. Benjamin means son of my right hand. So that's seen as a positive thing. But then the man who was of Benjamin was named Kish, and his name translates to bait or snaring. And it's like, wait, so we're going to get the son of a guy named Snare or Bait. This sounds a little fishy here. Yeah, if Saul is translated as asked for, then you guys have asked for this. But it's also, he's coming from, this is a snare, guys. Yeah. You should be seeing this. So he's described as, there's not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. He is head and shoulders above the rest in a physical way.
Yeah.
And so
this man was tall.
Yeah, he was tall somehow or another. And so that also leads, as we get into later on, when we get to Goliath, then if Goliath is even bigger than Saul, then you can imagine that Saul, if the average person even, let's say they're even just like 5.5 feet, then Saul is probably over 6 feet. And then Goliath is going to be that much more tall, because if Saul is like, oh, I can't really go up against this guy,
Yeah, right.
As he probably should as king, champion. But anyway, the main thing that I'm seeing in chapter 9 is just the providence of God. We've already seen this, especially in Ruth and everything. We talked about it a little bit, but we also see this in just how Saul is brought before Samuel. As far as Saul is, he's got to go after his dad's donkeys, they're missing and stuff. And then the guy that's with him, he's like, hey, let's go see this man of God before we go back and turn back and, not really sure where they went. And not only that, but God says to Samuel beforehand, he says, tomorrow around this time, then I'm going to bring you a man from Benjamin. And he's the one. Right. And then he further confirms it, when Saul shows up. So.
Right. Oh, yeah. And in verse 21, this is where Saul kind of like shrinks back, like, hey, I'm just a man from, I'm a Benjamite, I'm the smallest of Israel's tribes. Like, why me? And, I think that's like the first example of his humility, but then it's one of the only examples of his humility.
Yeah. He starts off humble.
Yeah. Yeah. So then in chapter 10 is where we get Samuel anointing Saul and some very specific things that are going to happen. Mm-hmm. And, this is how you'll know this is real.
Yeah.
And so he anoints him with oil and tells him the spiel, like, you're going to go and find 2 men here. They're going to give you, first one is
2 men by Rachel's tomb.
Yep. And then the other one is 3 men by a tall tree of Tabor. Mm. And they're going to give you 2 pieces of bread or 2 loaves of bread. They're going to be carrying 3.
Yeah.
And then you're going to go down to this, what
garrison
town
of Philistines.
Yeah. Gibeah of God, where the Philistines are. And then you'll, meet some prophets, and then you'll be prophesying along with them. And so it's crazy that all these things just happen. And what I took note of is that as soon as he turned away from Samuel to leave, God changed his inmost person. And so it wasn't just after all these things you do them and experience them, then God changes you. No, God changed him in the moment he was anointed. And so I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's good to note that the Spirit of the Lord does come upon Saul. And later on, we see a lot of repetition of the Spirit of God leaving Saul, coming on David. And not only that, but the Spirit of God was also replaced by either a harming spirit or a evil spirit, however it's translated. Yeah. So, God gave him another heart, and we can only see that, it was one of courage and, perhaps one of God is looking for someone who is after his own heart. And so there may have been part of that too.
Saul was confirmed 3 different ways, really, for his kingship.
Yeah.
The first one was he was anointed privately. The second one, he was brought before the people. I mean, even though he cowered behind the equipment.
He's hiding.
And then the third is, the beginning of chapter 11, where he defeats an army. And then that basically that's it. Saul is confirmed as king because of all these things.
I think it's interesting just to see the way that God is moving through all of this. So we've got in verse 18 of chapter 10, he said to the people of Israel, this is the Lord, the God of Israel. I brought Israel up out of Egypt. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, from the hand of all the kingdoms that you were opposing, or that were opposing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your calamities and your distresses. And I just see you're going from mountaintop high to valley low within that, as far as, man, yes, God, this is what God has done, but you've rejected him. And they're like, oh. But they don't seem to really get that. But God, on the other hand, he's using even their selfish desires and their desires to be just like the other nations, and he's still using it for his glory and to work his plan, basically.
Yep.
And he's going to deliver. And so even in this, one of the ways I see this is down in verse 26 of chapter 10. He says, Saul also went to his home, and with him the men of valor whose hearts God had touched. And so in the same way that God had touched or changed Saul's heart, perhaps he was also working this way too. Obviously in a precursor to taking on the Philistines.
Yeah.
So, well, and at least in this particular immediate, it's the Ammonites.
At the end of chapter 11, Samuel's saying, come on, let's go to Gilgal and renew the kingship there. So the people went to Gilgal and established Saul the king as king in the Lord's presence. And what struck me was that it said renew the kingship. And Saul has not been king, so what is there to renew? And basically my thought was, if you look at chapter 12, this whole thing is how Moses kind of set up a covenant renewal type deal. And, Joshua did it at the end of his life. Moses did it at the end of his life. This is basically, going through the history of what God has done, and he's explaining, this is the Lord taking care of you. And it's a covenant renewal back to the Lord rather than like, let's establish Saul as king and, look how great Saul is. no, Samuel's turning it around and making it about the Lord again. And I think that's sneaky and also correct.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's inspired by the Lord.
Yeah. So in chapter 12, we get Samuel's farewell address is what he says. Basically, he's kind of like, this is the transition of power in a sense. So you're really getting the transition from a prophet judge over to the king, and they're going to be looking to the king. They're not really going to be looking to Samuel so much anymore as the primary leader. And so this is what he's telling them. And in verse 14, that's one I kind of underlined and highlighted is, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandments of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord, it will be well. But then on the other hand, right after that, we get, the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king if you don't. And so this is what's at stake.
I also thought it was interesting that Samuel's like, hey, make sure that you charge me with the things that I've done wrong. And then, they can't find anything wrong with him.
Yeah.
And he's like, all right, well, just remember that you haven't found anything to accuse me with.
He's basically saying, hey, I've earned your trust. Yeah, I'm trustworthy, so listen to the words that I'm saying to you. I'm not here to deceive you or any ill gain or anything like that. And so even that, you're comparing that, contrasting that to perhaps what they were used to. So if they are looking at Hophni and Phinehas or Eli, perhaps even, then they're saying, okay, well, should we trust this guy?
Right.
I mean,
and I was thinking too that, even if it says that his sons were standing there with him, if his sons did anything wrong, maybe he would take that upon himself as well. But, they didn't accuse them in that moment of anything. So, I don't think Samuel thinks that he is perfect. So he did want to make sure that he hasn't wronged anybody.
Yeah. The warning is just good. I mean, in general, Samuel's warning to all of it, this is very relevant to us today. Don't be afraid, basically, of the people. Fear God as opposed to fearing man. The way that the people see their own sin. And he's like, he's saying, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, that we have added to all of our sins this evil, to ask for ourselves a king. And so they're seeing their own sin in that. And Samuel's like, don't turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, because they're empty. He's like, recognize them as such. But understand that God is faithful, and he's going to remain faithful regardless of what you guys do, because he's entered into a covenant. And so it is for his glory. And so he's basically saying, guys, because God is faithful, then follow after him. Be faithful in return. Love him in return, because he has loved you. And he's not given up on you. And so he reiterates that in verse 24, only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you.
So then chapter 13 brings us into the reign of Saul. How does your version put these first couple verses? How many years?
It says Saul lived for 1 year and then became king when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel. And so essentially, I think in looking at that and trying not be so confused by it as well, I think it does make the most sense to go back to their counting from when the Spirit of God kind of came upon him.
Yeah.
And Saul was a new man basically that day. He kind of changed him, so to speak.
So the Masoretic text says a son of a year. Then it says he ruled over Israel for 2 years. Saul was a son of a year when he began to reign, and then he ruled over Israel for 2 years. And that's like the most literal English from Hebrew. But the Greek, Septuagint says Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned Israel for 40 years. And now, if that is correct, then Samuel was like extremely old, because he's old when Saul was king, and he doesn't see Saul again until Saul's death, or maybe it's Samuel's death. I can't remember which one.
Yeah.
But anyway, that'd be a long time.
Yeah.
And maybe he did reign that long, but it doesn't mean anything for us right now. I just thought that was interesting that there's multiple ways that this could be translated as we look into the reign of Saul.
When he's called upon to fight the Philistines, then basically he knows that he's got to kind of like say, okay, well, we need to offer sacrifices to God. We need to seek the Lord basically in all of this. And so if he still has some humility about him, then that's what he's doing. And so there's several things that kind of lead to Saul's downfall. Not only we get number one with this unauthorized sacrifice type thing, and he's stepping into Samuel's place, then the kingdom, like as far as like his lineage is kind of taken from him. But then afterwards, when when it comes to like the vow that he makes and all that type of stuff, that's when God is basically saying, no, I've rejected you as king yourself.
Right.
Essentially, they're waiting for Samuel to arrive, and Samuel doesn't get there when they want him to, when he says that he will be there. And so we don't have all the backstory as far as what's happening. We're just seeing, what's happening because of Samuel not being there and stuff. And so we just kind of read between the lines and understand what is inferred. But it's funny to see that he says, so I forced myself, there in verse 12 and offered the burnt offering. I didn't want to do it. I didn't really mean to, that type of thing.
And so it kind of gives the idea that he needed to do this because all his people were fleeing and hiding.
Yeah, he was. And they were starting to basically say, we're not going to.
Yeah. So what would have happened if all of Israel backed out? Like, could they have just backed out? Sure. But Samuel got there, like, right as he's doing this or right after he did it. And, basically calls him out, like, what have you done? This was not what the Lord has commanded you to do.
Yeah.
And, basically the note that I took was the faith is starting to diminish. And so what Saul should have done was trust in the Lord. Instead, he took matters into his own hands and decided that he was going to offer the sacrifice in, I guess, hopes that God would be pleased. But instead, we find that God was not pleased in it.
Yeah.
Through what Samuel says.
Yeah, essentially, this is another case where people are fearing what they see in front of them.
Right.
And recognizing what's in front of me versus what is really there, like in a spiritual sense and the leadership of God and all of that God has clearly in the past demonstrated that he can take out lots of people with just a few. And so even though there's only 600, they should have remembered the stories of even Gideon. So within this, Samuel right away, he says, your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart in verse 14. And I think that's part of the reason why we see David described as a man after God's heart later on as fulfillment of this. But yeah, Saul is he's not really sure what to do really when it comes down to it. And so when you take the leadership aspect of Saul, then we're saying, okay, well, we're seeing some of the failings even just as a leader, so to speak, that he's not leading the people well.
Well, I think as we get to the end of chapter 13, we get this little note that a blacksmith could not be found in the land of Israel. Mm-hmm. And so now you're seeing that, what God could have used would have been miraculous, but instead now they've all fled and they don't have swords and there's no way that they're going to be able to fight. And so the only people that have swords, it says, are Saul and Jonathan.
Yeah. So Jonathan's like, hey, I got a sword.
Yeah.
I'm going to go see who I can take out. So he takes a young man, basically, who carried his armor, and he says, let's go see what we can do. Let's see if we can take out any of these guys or scout it out at the very least. And so that's what he does there in chapter 14. It's kind of interesting as far as the why behind it. Why does he do it in the first place? And, what is the main motivation? But we're seeing just how loyal, basically, Jonathan's servant is and how courageous Jonathan is. And in a sense, we would say, if we're just reading this and thinking, okay, well, Saul's king, but then Jonathan after him, we're thinking, okay, well, if we didn't know any better than Jonathan, this seems like he's a pretty courageous guy, right? This is going to be good. Like, he's going to be the one to fight. But we obviously know the bigger story and know that that's not the case.
Yeah, so Jonathan, kills a bunch of people.
So essentially,
just the two of them, him and his armor bearer. Says they wipe out 20, and then I think there's more that they ended up wiping out. Oh, it was because the Lord
caused an earthquake. Yeah. So they're basically, he's like, hey, let's figure out whether God is for us or against us in a sense. And so this is going to be a sign. If they say come up to us, then we're going to go and we're going to defeat them. And so that's what happens. They do.
Right.
Basically, the Philistine sword was against his fellow. Basically, there was great confusion, is what it said there in verse 20. And so then in verse 23, we see that even though people are trying to take matters into their own hand, it's still described the Lord saved Israel that day.
Yep.
God used all of this, even in spite of the people's decisions and stuff, and foolish decisions for that matter. God is still taking matters into his own hands as far as like, hey, this is what's going to happen, and he's going to save Israel.
Yeah.
So he does.
And so when we get to verse 24, Saul's like, hey, we got to avenge me. And so no one's going to eat until I'm avenged.
Yeah.
And this is weird to me. Because, and even Jonathan says it's weird. Like, no one should do this.
That's not such a good idea.
I think my opinion is that Saul is scatterbrained because he had just been told that, hey, your reign is over. Mm-hmm. And so now he's like, oh man, I got to like make up for this somehow. And so in his mind, he's like, I got to get the Philistines and, kill them here. And so in his plan is like, I'm going to motivate everybody with food. If you kill them, then you'll be able to eat.
Yeah.
But instead, Jonathan's like, hey, that's not how you shouldn't
That's
tell
not a
them.
good strategy.
Yeah, you can't make them weak so that they'll kill more. Anyway,
Yeah.
Jonathan ends up breaking this oath because he didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And, that comes back to Saul towards the end of this chapter. But he tasted the honey that was there, and his eyes gleamed, this version says. And that, meant that, hey, he was probably hungry and he needed to eat something so that he had his energy. But instead, he was cursed by his own father in that moment. Saul doesn't end up killing Jonathan. Basically, he's like, okay, we'll take that curse away. Like, that was stupid of me.
Well, and you're seeing even now, like, it doesn't say that the spirit has left Saul yet. Like,
Right.
that comes later. But at the same time, you're seeing where you tend to question that and say, okay, well, is Saul in his right mind even here because of, just his reactions and stuff and how much it seems like, and we see it more clearly later. So I'm not sure if this is the initial portion of this, but he very much wants to have those accolades. Like, he needs to make sure that people are like, yes, I am the leader. I'm the king. I'm the one who's protecting you. I'm the one who's delivering. I'm the one who's doing this stuff, basically.
Yeah.
And we can see anybody that's in power, anybody that's in leadership, that is at least temptation. They need to be able to say, yes, I am the one who did this. I'm the one who accomplished this. I'm the one who, so keep following me, that type of thing.
Right.
And so we're seeing some of this within Saul. And I think that's possibly at least one of the motivations behind, if Jonathan has done this and Jonathan has taken it upon himself and he's the one that, gets the accolades in a sense, then Saul is kind of, it rubs Saul the wrong way, basically.
I was actually just going to say that. Yeah, he's seen, a couple times where Jonathan has taken matters into his own hands because Saul's not doing anything. And, Jonathan now is, he's killed all these guys and the Lord is kind of with him, it seems like. And so Saul has kind of like, hey, I got to make sure that people still know that I'm in charge.
Yeah.
And so you see the pride start to come out. And I think, back to what you said, we hadn't seen the Spirit of God leave Saul. We have an option every single day to walk in the Spirit or walk in our flesh. And I think that there is room here to say that Saul can choose to walk in the will of the Lord by the Spirit or walk in his flesh. And I think he's choosing to walk in his flesh more often here, probably for the sake of his own pride.
Yeah.
His name, it seems like.
The people, they have to ransom Jonathan from his own father. And so he didn't die that day, basically. And apparently this is the only time that Saul and Jonathan really have a falling out that we see until it's made known to Saul that Jonathan is like siding with David, basically.
Yeah, right.
So this is not the only time where it's father against son, but for now, it seems like the matter's just, okay, we're moving on. We do see, going to what we just said at the very end of chapter 14, verse 52, it says, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself, basically. So he's like, hey, if you can fight, if you're a good guy, then you're mine.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Obviously the king wants the best fighters and stuff, but at the same time, it's kind of like he's surrounding himself by the best people so that he looks good.
My thought, too, before we get into 15 and kind of wrap this thing up, when Samuel is, back in chapter 7, said that the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Samuel is still alive during these points. And I wonder if all the days of Samuel means just his judgment days or judging days, or does it mean all the days that Samuel lived? Just thinking that maybe part of the reason that Saul is still surviving the Philistines and kind of keeping them at bay is because of Samuel and what God had promised to Samuel there.
Yeah, maybe so.
Anyway, doesn't change anything. Just a thought I had.
Yeah. And so chapter 15 is where we really see the downfall of Saul, as far as he is certainly not willing to do what God has said. And that's kind of the test of a good king or a bad king is, are they going to listen to the Lord? Are they going to walk in his ways, or are they not? And so Samuel comes to Saul and he says, God is telling you, you need to completely wipe out the Amalekites. This is the time where he says, don't spare anyone, man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, camel, donkey, anything. Basically, you need to annihilate it. Obviously, that doesn't happen. Saul spares Agag, the king of the Amalekites, which comes into play later on. We'll kind of come into that as far as how that plays into Israel's history later on when we get there in the books that follow. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fattened calves, the lambs, all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. And then that's when we get to verse 11. The Lord speaks to Samuel again. He says, hey, I regret that I've made Saul king. So you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. Well, one, we see God commanding Saul to do one thing, and it's just to kill everything. Like he had been given one commandment. And I think too, if we go back to, chapter 13, we see that, the Lord has already said, hey, you're done. But this was really it for Saul here. Saul did not obey the Lord in this, and thus the Lord says, I regretted that I have made Saul king. And what I immediately thought of was Genesis 6, where God is saying, hey, mankind is so evil, and the ways they're not even walking with me. I regret that I have made mankind. And it's not like God didn't know this was going to happen kind of thing. And God obviously instated Saul as king. And so these are not, God doesn't do wrong things.
Yeah, it's not a mistake that he's regretting.
He's not regretting that he made Saul king in the fact that, like, man, I should have picked someone better. Yeah. No, he's regretting that he made Saul king and that Saul doesn't walk in his ways. I think that we can see, and this will probably make more sense when we do the next podcast, but you can see Saul as a reference to like the first Adam who had, one thing to obey. You can eat of any tree in the garden except for the one. And Saul here is you can be king as long as you kill all these people. Yeah. And essentially neither of these people obeyed the Lord in what they were supposed to do. And so that means that a better has to come. And so Samuel has reminded Saul of this in chapter 13. He reminds him again at the end of chapter 15. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to one of your colleagues who is better than you. And so
that's harsh.
There is a better one coming. And so we know that to be David. And in terms of the first Adam versus the second Adam, we know the second Adam to be Christ. And so there is the better that has come. And so this is kind of like for me, I just see it as a foreshadowing. Yeah. And I think David being compared to Christ is not that abstract. So, Jesus is compared to David all the time. Certainly. So to see Saul as the poorer predecessor makes sense to me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And we will see that, especially as we move in next time in the next podcast and we move to David and see the contrast even more so between Saul and David and how much David seeks God and how Saul did not. Essentially what Samuel accuses him of, he's like, why didn't you obey the voice of the Lord, like he said, and pounce on the spoil? Why did you do this evil? And so one of the things that we need to end on, I guess, is when Samuel is talking to Saul, he says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. So as much as this whole issue of sacrifices and are we doing what God wants by the letter of the law and all that type of stuff, what is really better than the actual checks on the boxes and stuff is the motives and stuff behind it as far as how are we obeying? Is it really just through the motions, or is it the hard attitude that's obeying? Are we obeying? And he says, you've rejected the word of the Lord, and so he's rejected you as king. And so Saul's response is, I feared the people and obeyed their voice. And that's where I feel like that's been key all throughout this time too. Yeah. Do we fear God, or do we look out and see what we see and fear man or circumstances or what have you?
Yeah. I think it's also the pinnacle of everyone was doing right. That was whatever they thought was right, in their own eyes. And so Saul is kind of doing that here. And with the way that he has demonstrated the sacrifices kind of just as like a, almost, like the ark was, it's just a good luck charm. We have to do this to make sure that God is pleased with what we're doing. All very superstitious things that were probably influenced by the other tribes that were living in the land, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Philistines even. And so the departure from the ways of God is kind of all intermingled with, whatever's going on around them. And so they were listening to the voice of man as a nation, as well as, Saul as a king.
Yeah.
So it's just a reminder for us to always walk in step with the Spirit.
Instead of abiding, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And to know God is different from just knowing about God.